You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
This is the CRM Archaeology Podcast. It's the show where we pull back the veil of cultural resources management archaeology and discuss the issues that everyone is concerned about. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello and welcome to the CRM Archaeology Podcast, episode 307 for March of 2025. I'm your host, Heather McDaniel-McDevitt, and on today's podcast, we are going to talk about Section 106 goes to court. I don't think anyone's going to be surprised that we're talking about that today. And, oh boy, you know, I think there's so much since we came up with this, and this is Doug's idea on this one, and this is kind of a carryover from our last episode when we had Spencer Pelton on. We were talking about the executive orders. But before we get into that, first I want to welcome Andrew to the show from Southern California.
And I am so happy to be here, Heather.
And Bill in Northern California.
Good morning.
And Doug in Scotland.
See, with Andrew's intro, I now felt like so much pressure to say something really amazing, and completely failed. Like, Andrew just came in with like, I mean, like,
amazing thing.
Yikes.
Yeah, and then me, I'm actually in Southern Florida for work.
What the?
Oh, dude,
escaping the rain, I see, huh? Or is it raining there too?
I'm very close to the Keys, and
wow. So
I'm representing the East Coast.
Okay, great.
It's like 80 degrees there right now, isn't it?
It actually was really nice. Yesterday it was like in the low 70s. Yeah, it was nice. But the humidity, I'm not quite used to it, but I'm not going to complain. I could be in Chicago or...
And for the rest of the world viewers who are not, you know, or listeners who are not in the States, you know, that's in the 20s. It's 20s in Celsius.
Sorry.
In February.
Jeez, that sounds really cold.
It does.
In February too.
So we have a lot to cover today. So I think we're just gonna go straight into it. And Doug, I'm gonna just push it over to you.
Yeah. So I thought this podcast was going to go a bit differently, and actually, we're slightly delayed. I should say we're recording this on February 23rd, because it's, you know, Trump administration. Like, by the time you're listening to this, we could have already like been overtaken by other events, and the topic of this was sort of overtaken. We were going to look at some of the legalities of what happened if they opened up the regulations around Section 106, which was somewhat of the thoughts that might happen a couple of weeks ago. But now, two changes in the last 3-4 days is basically they've come out and sort of straightened out some of the thoughts around what the national emergency presidential declaration is around oil and gas and how that's going to impact historic properties. And they've also done a sort of, I guess you could call it, I would call it an ingenious way of essentially legally being able to remove NEPA overarching regulations. They basically found a loophole to be able to do that in the regulations, to basically get rid of them all and now set them back down to each agency to decide what they're going to be doing for NEPA. So those are the two developments. I think in this first segment, we're going to try to talk a bit about what's going on and what these mean. And I'll just give a quick summary. Probably, if I could sum this up in like one word, lawsuits. So that's where we're going with everything, especially for NEPA. Once they've sort of removed that top level regulations and now it goes down to all the agencies, basically, unless they all keep doing exactly what they were doing, which they still might do, there's going to be discrepancies and there's going to be lawsuits about, you know, is that actually according to the law? And it's going to be sort of a huge issue. But I think we should focus on National Historic Preservation Act. And basically, there's been an emergency declared, and in the regulations, I believe it's 800.12. Yeah, 800.12 is the procedure. So that's the regulations that come under if emergency is declared. And that changes up a bit of what happens potentially around oil and gas. And it's, again, it's going to be all over the place. So to say that, actually, we can't really say what's going to happen, because essentially, if you go and read those, if you really love government regulations and stuff, if you go and read it, it basically says if an agency has a procedure for emergency, follow that. If not, follow the agreements that are between agencies and the council. And there's like 22 of those, and it actually gets more complicated because I went and looked up the BLM one, which just basically says, oh, our agreement is that we're going to have agreements with states. And so I think there's like 11 or 12 state agreements. I happened to look up the one for New Mexico. Wonderful mentions about, fires, because it's the Southwest, stuff like that. But basically it then points back to the top level arrangements as well. So it's going to be all over the place. Depends who the lead agency is, depends what agreements they have in place. It's going to be kind of a mess. And I'm pretty sure those documents have probably got, like, if I was the web stats guy looking at it, I would kind of wonder why all of a sudden, like, all these documents saw a spike in traffic. Because I'm pretty sure most everyone in CRM has suddenly started to go look and see what these regs actually said on emergencies. But it's kind of all over the place at the moment. It's going to be fragmented. Some of them are going to sort of follow the main regulations, the 812, which again is also complicated in that if, local government's the responsible head agency for the 106, they can basically say no. So your SHPO, if the SHPO is the sort of the lead agency on the 106, they basically, as long as they do the objection within 7 days, they can say no. And then it goes back to the normal process of 106. And yeah, it's going to be all over the place. But in terms of impact, it's kind of hard to say. So one of the things is basically it cuts down the notification to like SHPOs and TIPOs and Native American tribes and Native Hawaiian groups to basically, they get like 7 days to comment back on what exists there on the high level. So it really makes it a really quick process there. But it's going to be confusing, and I just think there's going to be a lot of lawsuits, because essentially there's two ways to do lawsuits around regulations. One is basically process-based. So if you didn't follow the process, they can sue and block it. And now there's 20-some different processes possibly going on, maybe more, maybe 30 different processes. So if someone, was supposed to do something in 7 days and they did in 8 days, well, they failed. Someone can sue them, restart the clock on the process. The other aspect is this actually legal? But before we jump into all that stuff, I think I'll throw it over to my other host to see what your guys' thoughts are.
All right. I just want to go really quick on this, and I'm really curious about what Heather has to say. So to me, I tried to understand this as best I could, and I think the three of you actually understand this better than me, if anything. But I think we have to remember that this executive order first is energy focused only, right? So if you're in CRM and you're working on like a new housing tract, this doesn't mean anything to you, right? This is like if you're working on an oil and gas pipeline, like that kind of stuff. So first off, it's not that all of CRM has crumbled overnight, And then second, what does this emergency mean? And as you were talking about, Doug, and how it felt to me, and I know this is a gross overgeneralization, but just that it wasn't just that everyone goes home and you start drilling, but it's basically that the process is sped way up, like you were talking about the 7 days or this kind of thing. So that's what I was able to learn just sort of like with my deep dive. But that's the best I could do with the information that I had. There you go.
So before we jump to Heather, in the wonderful confusion that everything is, weirdly, some housing developments have been swept up into this, but probably, again, if they go through, that'd be a lawsuit and then they'd be kicked out. or it was a mistake, but basically they put out a list of quote unquote 600 projects. And I'm pretty sure it's one of those things where someone literally did a search and just put in like petroleum, because it's like a housing build on a former petrochemical site or something like that. Of course. So they're like, yeah, this is going to be a project that's sped up, but it has nothing to do with oil and gas. So there's going to be a lot of confusion. I'm sure that list is going to be cut down quite a bit because, like, a lot of first reactions from like environmental groups were like, well, there's 600, but like a lot of these don't really make sense and probably are not part of it. It's probably more of a press release.
I'm sorry, Doug. As you were talking, 600 what?
600 quote unquote projects that are permittable.
There we go. Yeah.
That should go out. Basically, they did this announcement about the energy emergency and what it's going to do. They announced it both for historic sites, but also environmental ones. And they put out a list of 600, I think 60 some potential projects that they said now we'll be able to go ahead really quickly. Yeah. But again, some of those aren't really energy projects. So probably it's not going to happen.
They're just trying.
Yeah. The big numbers, biggest numbers ever.
Well, I think the one thing that I'd like to kind of just put to rest, if possible, is, first of all, this idea that, NEPA is completely disappearing and it's going to be completely gutted and it doesn't exist anymore is in large part a misunderstanding of the executive order, whether you agree with it or not. Let's just look at the facts here. So there's the Council on Environmental Quality. The executive order basically says that Council on Environmental Quality, which is an agency, it's a White House agency that coordinates like the federal environmental tasks. And, it's been around for a long time. It was established by NEPA back in 1969. But what had happened is that there are these quote unquote regulations, binding regulations, which CEQA did not have the authority to issue these. And so this executive order pulls that back and says the CEQ, Council on Environmental Quality, it's those regulations, basically how NEPA is used, just from the CEQ's perspective, those have been pulled back because they didn't have, was not the intent or the role of the CEQ. So that, I just kind of wanted to start there as far as, what that executive order means. It does not mean that NEPA does not exist anymore. And I think there's a lot of people that understand that, but I think there's enough people that don't. So I just kind of want to put everybody's mind at ease. And just like Doug was saying, now there's maybe that just not going to put your mind totally at ease, but it is not as bad as some people are pushing. So NEPA still exists. There are still, now it's going to be, more on the states. And just like you said, Doug, it is definitely going to be all over the place. We're not going to have we're not going to have consistency. Although I will tell you, from somebody who works in lots of different states, there isn't that much consistency. But anyway, so I'll just kind of stick with that because we're getting near the end of the segment. We'll be right back with segment 2. Welcome back to the CRM Archaeology Podcast, episode 307. We're talking about all the changes. I'm not even going to try to give you a little breakdown, but we're in segment 2. And Bill, you had a statement that was definitely too big to tackle in the end of the first segment. So
yeah, no problem. So, we were talking about how the laws are quite complicated, and just focusing on energy law is like the first step, right? And so, in some ways, some of us that are more skeptical could be like, well, this is just the first step, right? But the even bigger thing that we need to think about is what happens if folks are placed at agencies that otherwise would have administered these regulations, and they're, inside candidates or folks that are sympathetic to the overall goals of an administration. So let's just say that the administration's goals are to just not comply with any environmental laws overall, and they're starting with energy and using that as an emergency, but systematically going through every agency and replacing the existing folks with folks who are sympathetic to the cause of no more environmental laws. Like, what happens then? What happens if everyone at all the agencies that it's in charge has been told not to care about environmental laws, and then they end up being the handmaidens who do that?
So I have an answer for that. And that was like my one word answer for the beginning, which is lawsuits. So essentially, yeah, basically there's going to be a lot of lawsuits about these things. One is procedural, but even off the bat, it looks like the council has opened itself up to a lawsuit because the regulations say an emergency can be declared, and then the agencies can come back. They have to do it within 30 days of the emergency being declared and ask for an extension. But the council just came out right off the bat and just said, this is in effect. And, the extension lasts basically for as long as the quote unquote emergency lasts, which will probably be the length of Trump's term. And then, if a Democrat gets in, they'll close it down. Another Republican may last longer or not. It's hard to predict the future. But for that to happen, the agencies have to have gone back to the council to ask for that. And it's not actually very clear that that's happened at all. So effectively, potentially any project that goes beyond those 30 days using this emergency framework is opening itself up to being sued and losing because they didn't follow the regulations. And there's going to be all sorts of like these little, compliance issues and all that stuff. I mean, like, if history repeats itself, the Trump administration is going to lose like 80% of them. So they did a whole, there's been a couple of studies. I'm a big stat person. It's great. Like, they literally looked at like all the challenges against Trump and his first administration. And, most administrations, their win rate is like 70%. I think it's actually like 68, 69% is the average. And his was like 22, 23% over 4 years. And that's because they were not very big on procedural people. They were very much on, we're going to tear down government, fire a bunch of people, as they're doing now. But you have to follow those rules or you're going to get sued and then you're going to lose. And so potentially, like, I suspect a lot of projects we probably might run into two groups. So people who have done Section 106 before, big contractors, large companies, are basically just going to be like, yeah, we're going to keep doing what we're doing, which is the same thing we've always been doing because we don't want to basically get sued, which will then potentially, they could put an injunction in on the project and make it last, be like, oh, well, we're going to put an injunction while this court case goes through. So, that's like 2, 4, 6, 10, 12 years. I mean, they can last for forever. So they might just keep doing that to avoid being sued. And then you might end up with sort of, I might be stereotyping some people, but some smaller sort of wildcat sort of organizations who, see this as an advantage, but then again, they're going to get sued and potentially either shut down their oil well or their pipeline for a long time until it gets resolved, or shut down the project entirely. And even like, again, I don't think anyone looked through it because they're moving so fast, but these emergency regulations aren't actually that friendly to building. So like the ones that I looked up New Mexico because, home state and all that stuff. But, if it's occurring on BLM land, the emergency regulations there that should be the ones that are put in place basically says that you must treat every site, everything that's potentially known, as being eligible. So you haven't even gone through the process of like, determining is it eligible or not. You have to basically assume every single thing is eligible. And that could, potentially be a lot more expensive than just sending out an archaeologist for like 2 days to have a look at these sites and be like, oh yeah, no, not eligible for the lists. It's going to be basically lots and lots of this is going to be a job creation program for lawyers, basically. That's what's going to happen. It's going to create so much work for so many courts, paralegals, lawyers. It's probably going to be a bonanza, actually. And honestly, I think they've probably handed like Sierra. Yeah, Sierra Club has probably just been like, this is like handing them like a gift. I don't know, like Christmas came early to them, or like the National Council for Historic Preservation, like National Trust for Historic Preservation, they've just handed like so many ways that they could basically sue and hold up so many projects.
Yeah,
because it's the way to do it.
Well, and that you're talking about jobs creation. I also have wonder a lot about the recommendation that things need to be expedited and stuff has to get done in X amount of days, right? So I can also see where, I can't tell the future, but I can also see where those agencies that are quite familiar with the process in the, push to get things done in the expedited review window will just start, put more people on the project, right? Like, if you otherwise would have had 5 CRM archaeologists, now magically you throw on 7 because you need to get it done sooner, or, bigger bonuses for getting the report done faster. I mean, it also seems to me like that is a pathway too, which rather than saving money will actually end up spending more money.
Yeah, it actually might. It's hard to tell. I think it's going to be all over the place. It'll just depend who has the project, who's the lead agency, what's the regs, who does it. But yeah, potentially you could end up with like more higher wages on some projects, because it'll be like, we have 1 week to do this, and we need people, and we're willing to pay whatever. And so it's probably actually going to end up costing taxpayers, which, well, I don't make enough money to have to pay that second tax in America, but it's going to cost you guys probably more money, like 2 cents or something.
I live in California where it's fantasy land on taxes anyway, so don't worry. If there's a way to increase taxes, we'll either vote for it or they'll just magically find a way for it to happen.
Man, I don't have any great segue out of. We'll probably get paid more taxes.
Not only that, but
I
love it when that happens.
Well, and in the past, I worked on a project that was one of those, let's get it done super fast. It was one of those Reinvestment Act ones in the wake of the 2008 recession. And I'm not joking. We had like 35 archaeologists on this project. I mean, there was like 6 crew chiefs and a couple PhDs running these huge crews to dig all these features. There was, multiple backhoes trenching this thing. And it was like a 9-month project. And it was one of those, hey, hurry, let's get this thing done because the president has said XYZ and this agency needs to be in compliance. And they just hired an army of folks. And it worked for a long time.
You're still doing the work, though.
Yeah, no, I know.
You're just doing it faster. So
yeah, and and that one was also one of those like, got to get it done by X amount of days, and so the agency was like, yeah, well, you know what, we'll just get a huge army of folks to get it done.
Well, I'll just say it again. That's not going to cost more. It just means that you have to find the people, which that might cost more because you have to have competitive wages to bring everybody in. So I don't know, this concept that CRM is going away. It's not going away. And in fact, I think there may be more and more work and more consistent work, because people are going to have to be on the ready. Like the idea that you can just hire as needed and cross your fingers hoping that you're going to have the big staff that you need in order to get something done within a period of time that's allotted. That's very hard to do when you're just relying on, a big crew of as needed people that have other companies that are trying to hire them for the same reason. So, I do think it's going to change how people are hired. I don't think that we're looking at a significant reduction in the amount of archaeologists that are going to be needed. I really don't. But I mean, it is hard to tell. And the one thing that I did want to just go back just a little bit on the CEQ, Council of Environmental Quality. I wanted to make sure that people understand that this isn't like they're not going to have any kind of oversight. It just means that these are going to be guidelines. The guidelines are still going to be reworked. They're still going to be looked at and they're still going to exist, but they're not going to be binding. And that was part of the problem, the reason for the lawsuits before this all happened. So anyway, I wanted to go back on that. And then I did want to talk just a little bit on, since we're talking about, employment and, how many jobs are going to be out there. I did want to just touch on that. So just, Doug, do you have something? This is your subject. So do you have something you want to talk on?
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I was going to bring in, it may not change anything as well. So like the Permian Basin, Texas, New Mexico, huge gas, oil area for the country. We actually don't do archaeology or survey there anymore. So basically they got an agreement. There were so many oil wells put in there and so much work, seismic activity for checking out, that basically they kept recording the same sites like 10, 20 times. You could go through the record and, like almost every other year a site's been visited. And so what they basically actually did was, in certain areas, they feel that they have enough survey where they basically found everything. Instead of forcing people to do another survey, they just put money into a pot that then goes to research-based projects. So even if there was that emergency thing and they're not doing survey in the parts of the Permian Basin, it's not going to affect the archaeology because they haven't done surveys there for 15 years? No, 18, it's maybe 20 years in certain areas. So that money will still get paid in, and it's not going to change anything there. That's a huge oil and gas area. So a lot of those smaller projects on gas wells and stuff like that, we're not actually going to see any difference because there's not actually work really happening.
Yeah. And, as far as just to touch, because we have a few more minutes, I think this is a good way of ending the segment. So, there's been a lot of talk about the layoffs. It's always sad when people are laid off. I mean, it's a very scary situation to lose your job, especially if it's one that you love dearly, you really enjoyed. It was something you had worked really hard to get to that point. And especially, you get hired. Those that are being laid off right now are probationary. So probationary meaning they've been in their specific job for a certain amount of time, typically a year. And that also includes people that may have been working for the National Park Service for years, but had recently been promoted into a new position. And so now that position, they are now probationary. So, it's scary and it's sad, but this is not uncommon. There were a lot of layoffs in 2017 when Biden came into office. And also just remember, this is not, of course, not to say I don't personally have compassion or the other hosts don't have compassion for those that did lose their jobs, but we do need to at least deal with the facts here. We have 2,300 that were let go. It's my brains that were let go in the National Park Service, 1,000 in National Park Service, but 800 in BLM. And the National Park Service, all these right now are probationary roles that were let go. I think there were maybe a few others, but for the most part, it was probationary. If we look that across the national parks, we have over 400 national parks. You're looking at 2 per national park. I'm sure it's more in some areas than in other areas, but this is not a massive layoff. That does not mean that it's not hurtful to those that were laid off and they now have their life in upheaval and they have to find another job. Yes, that is the case, but it's not like this mass gutting of the National Park Service that some people are imagining it is. So with that, I think we're going to switch over to segment 3, and we'll be right back. Hey, welcome back to CRM Archaeology Podcast, episode 307. We are on the third segment, or wrapping up this topic, which, just like last recording, is for sure going to just spring. We're going to have another episode, I'm sure, on this. I have a feeling this is all we're going to be talking about this year. But anyway, I did want to say one correction. I said 2017, the last segment, as far as the layoffs. I meant 2020, but it also happened in 2017. And then it happened at every administration has layoffs. So anyway, I just wanted to correct myself. So, Doug.
Yeah, I think going back to our previous question, also, back to Bill's, what happens if you sort of have people who don't want to enforce the law? And actually, I'm pretty sure there's not many people who've gone through and read through the regulation, Section 106, because it's not just Section 106, there's a whole law. There's actually a section in the National Historic Preservation Act that literally says, so while Section 106 is actually quite small, there's other sections throughout, and some of those were added by amendments in 1980 and 1992, which expanded Section 106 to include tribal representation and consultation, stuff like that. So while it is a very small section that a lot of stuff is built on, there's actually other sections in the Act that sort of expands that out and what needs to happen in Section 106. And one of those is literally just saying that agencies cannot avoid Section 106. They can't undertake work that basically undermines or in any way is seen to try to skirt under, avoid, I don't know, use whatever words you want to do Section 106. So again, potentially, this is probably going to be lawsuits. They're going to take years to work their way through the courts. But if someone wants to, again, this emergency declaration might not actually be legal within the regulations, and it might not actually be legal within the overall act. So if you guys had seen the stuff that came out from ACRA and different organizations a couple of months ago saying that Section 106 and the regs around them are all safe with the change in the Looper Bright case, and we'll get to that in just a moment. What they somewhat did mention was actually, part of the regulations that were the big redo. It took 7 years to do it. They put them out, and 2000 they got sued by the mining trade body, won most of it, which made most of those regulations safe. But actually, one of them they basically found was an overstep. That actually the council had given itself in the regulations the ability to basically challenge agency findings and say they were wrong. And that was not in the act. And so it was seen as an overreach and basically declared illegal. And they had to take it out of the regulations, which they did. But the same could happen. Like, there could be a challenge, and they could basically go back to that section of the act and say, well, this emergency declaration is actually just an attempt to get around doing Section 106. And it could go through the courts, and it might basically fail, or, well, I guess the emergency thing could fail as well. And part of that is actually this change. I'm not sure if anyone has kept up with their legal cases. There used to be what's known as the Chevron doctrine, which was if there was ambiguity in the documents or the laws, the agencies could basically do an interpretation, and their interpretation, if it was reasonable, reasonable has this huge backing in legal terms. So when I say reasonable, don't think of this as like a common term of reasonable. Think about this like if I was talking about some Latin term, because it's really what it comes down to in legal sense. As long as those are reasonable, they would defer. Now, the courts threw that out last year with the Looper Bright and basically said, instead of deferring to the executive on what these regulations would mean, it now goes back to the courts. And so potentially people looked at it as sort of it was going to affect and be more harmful for the environment. But actually, somewhat, going back to Bill's question and comment, what happens if you have administrators who basically don't want to fulfill their obligations or try everything they can to, say, change the regulations or the rules or their interpretation or their actions, anything like that, to not enforce it? This actually takes away a lot of that power that you used to be able to get away with a lot more with that in the executive. And now it goes back to the judicial. And so, again, it's just going to be more lawsuits, lots of lawsuits, but it's going to be decided in the courts. And it's actually going to make it a lot easier for, say, anyone now to, say, challenge the Trump administration, because there's no longer that sort of almost instant win of, oh, well, the agency says it, so it must be true. That is, of course, a bit of an exaggeration and a simplification. There's a lot more there. We don't have the next 6 hours of a podcast to go through all the legal bits of that. But yeah, I honestly am just seeing like massive amounts of lawsuits in the future and all sorts of questions about, is this legal? And actually, probably the current administration is going to lose a lot more because of this in a somewhat ironic twist.
I kind of feel like the lawsuits are actually the goal of it because they'll slow things down in the short term, right? And so, it'll be easy to say the entire system's broken and therefore we shouldn't really listen to anything. But I guess maybe I'm a negative person. But I it just seems to me like the lawsuits are the goal, to make ambiguous laws so that purposefully, it sparks a reaction that then just ties everything up.
So I think Bill and I are more on that side of things than maybe Heather and Andrew in our sort of tin hat conspiracies. But I will say, I don't know if you can call this more hopeful, but I think that is a step too far in their ability to think. And this, I will be completely honest, this is based on what I see, and this will be my perception. But honestly, like they put out that list of 600 projects that quote unquote the Emergency Act is going to go through, and they even double check it. There was projects that have no relation to energy and gas. Like honestly, most of it just feels like they're going through the motions of, they're not looking for governance. They're not actually really looking to so much to change the system. They're just looking to make splashy headlines and just like, I don't think they actually think about this mess. Like this is going to cause a massive mess. So many lawsuits. It's going to slow down oil and gas production, and all these projects are going to be slowed down by lawsuits. And I don't think they even care. Like that sort of assumes that they care about morphing the country into like their ideology or anything like that. I feel like that might be a step beyond their thinking. But again, that is a personal opinion. I will be very clear on that. This is not me looking at numbers and saying like, this is a fact. I'm just looking at it and being like, it just seems like a shit show like the first term. And
Well, I mean, they did not hire career bureaucrats, right? So it's like a combo of the cabinet from Idiocracy mixed with like the cabinet or the group of people that Dr. Evil was working with. And we all know how that turns out.
Yeah, I mean, like there's quite a bit of power that they could really do to change things. And maybe we spend the last minutes thinking about like, if we had that power, what we do to change things. But like, so in the regulations in the Act, the National Historic Preservation, they basically say the council can put together regulations that implement it. So all that, all the 800 regs are basically been empowered to the council, and that can be changed at any time. Of course, any changes could then lead to lawsuits, but there's other regulations as well. So like there's parts in there where the Secretary of Interior has been given power, and it's, by currently in the law system, if the law says so-and-so has this power, then they have that power, and that's not affected by Looper, Bright, and all those court cases. So like, if we wanted to, we could lobby the Secretary of Interior to change the Secretary of Interior's qualifications to be an archaeologist. We could change any of those Section 106 regs that come out from the council. And I guess I throw it up to you guys, maybe it could happen in this administration, or in the next, or in the future. But if you could change anything, because we could change a lot, what would you actually change? Bueller?
I know. Okay, I'll go first. So I love this question. I think it's funny for me. What matters for me is being a resident of California. And I was just thinking about this. I think I'm a 4th generation resident of California, something crazy. But the short answer is the federal laws I've overall been pretty cool with, be it Section 106, et cetera, et cetera. I feel like they've made sense. I feel like I've been okay with it. Sure, there's a couple nips and tucks. Like sometimes there's kind of a multi-layering of agencies and stuff. You're like, oh, come on. I think, haven't we already done this? But overall, I can deal. What kills me, honestly, is actually the state of California laws. Like some of it has just become ludicrousville. And so if I was like all-seeing Emperor God King, I would kind of just continue with the federal stuff. Maybe a few nips and tucks. I get it, but overall I'm cool. But the California stuff, I'd be like, dude, let's just go with the feds and stop all this mirroring of federal law and then making it 10 times worse.
I mean, if I had any suggestions to the secretary, it'd be prioritize 110, because just like you said in the Permian Basin, right? If you're actually out there looking at all of the stuff and you have a pretty good idea where stuff's at, and you also know which zones have been covered, then what is there really to do? Like, rather than waiting for 106, like, you already actually know what's in your land and what you have.
Oh, and Bill, what is 110?
Oh, sorry. 110 is a section of the National Historic Preservation Act that recommends or encourages agencies to proactively survey the lands under their administration for cultural resources in advance of, a project that could create adverse effects to eligible or potentially eligible historic properties.
It's a programmatic. It's like a programmatic approach.
Yes.
Too. Yep.
Yeah.
Which I'm in favor of big time.
Yeah, because, not only does it set aside budget for cultural resources rather than like pushing to get money in advance of construction, you have folks essentially on retainer that are constantly looking over your lands and trying to look at areas where you have sites and then occasionally looking at areas that don't, right? And so I've been part of some 110 projects. They're really cool because there's no urgency that this very second dozers are rolling. And so you really can work with tribes. You can spend your time looking at, historic properties and other stuff because it's not super urgent that this has to happen tomorrow.
Yeah. You stole my thunder, Bill. That was actually,
sorry.
No, it's good because I agree that I really do think having more of a programmatic approach and a very systematic way of looking at cultural resources is definitely a much more effective way of preservation. It really is. And when we're not in a rush to make these decisions, and when people don't have, people breathing down their necks or applicants breathing down their necks, like it's made, I think these decisions can be made a lot less emotionally when we do it in a programmatic way. The other thing is that, listen, the bureaucracy has created this situation. We would be really naive to say that the bureaucracy that is a large part of our disciplines has not created this situation that we're in right now. I mean, it's a slow process. It's convoluted. It's many times not consistent, and it has allowed for so much just long periods of assessments that are really ridiculous, and people taking advantage of, people being overrun by work, others not doing work. And now we're just completely inefficient. And this is now it's come to a head. And I think that for, wherever people sit on one side or the other, we need to wake up and we need to have a more expedient way and a more common sense approach instead of having bureaucracy for the sake of bureaucracy. And whether people agree with what's going on right now or not, my hope is, the optimist in me, is that this is going to clean things up a little bit. And I know Doug's going to say that's no way that's happening, but I really do hope that people realize, okay, we've gotten into this situation because, and this is coming from somebody who works in California, obviously a lot. It's ridiculous. The amount of time and the amount of expense that somebody has to endure, an applicant has to endure, even for a single family home, is outrageous. And that is what bureaucracy has created.
Yeah, see, Heather, that's what I was kind of hinting at. For me, it's always the California stuff that really brings me down.
Yeah. But I think it's not just California. I mean, this is definitely on the federal side too. I mean, I work with it all the time. There's nothing but excuses as to why things can't happen in a timely fashion or in a reasonable fashion.
Yeah, so I'm not going to not agree with you, Heather. But I would say
A double negative. You can't.
Are you agreeing?
I don't even know what that means.
This show cannot do double
That's a
negatives.
bureaucratic way of
Yeah.
no. What I was going to say is, unfortunately, I think part of those problems, and this is a completely different podcast, because I can look at our time and see that we've gone over already a minute. It was to say is like actually. Part of that is the bureaucracy that has to work inside of the regulations. We don't have enough time to go into that. But honestly, like, I would love to see a completely different system, and you'd have to change the law on that. It's because, there's things like, there's all sorts of things like consultation. I think that's where you get a lot of the bureaucracy, because basically it says you have to consult, but actually it gives very little power. So like, yes, you must consult the tribes and stuff, but if you still want to like bulldoze through their, sacred site or their grandparents' graves, the agency can still find a way to do that. And I think you would have to completely gut, and we don't have enough time to cover this, like actually the laws to make them more people or community friendly. Maybe that could be for a different podcast, but I would say there's different ways of doing it. There's a better, kinder future that we could strive for.
So, yeah, exactly. Once again, going back to 110, because I don't think consultation is the problem if you're actually on time, right? Rather than waiting for dozers to come. And this is what tribes and a lot of communities are saying. Rather than waiting for the day that you're going to try to sneak a freeway bypass, right through our neighborhood, maybe have us be part of the planning process. Like rather than thinking that consultation is a problem or a kink in the system, add it as a feature so that you can get a better understanding and better outcomes, in the end.
And as always, Bill was in like half the time and much more eloquent than what I was trying to say. Yeah, just ditto what Bill said. That's all the points I wanted to make.
And you know what? That doesn't have to be left to the bureaucracy. That is our job as consultants to push that along. Now, obviously, consultation needs to occur government to government, specifically with tribes, but it can be a lot faster if savvy consultants are pushing that process along. There are things that consultants can do to make that timing and can affect the timing.
Part of that also, that goes back to this, maybe your point there, Heather, about like if we could change the 800 regs, because that does put a sort of sequential process and point, which actually makes it, I feel like that process, well, I should say everything, like I don't want to, a lot of people put a lot of effort into those things over the years and over the decades. I think it's not like, it's better than having nothing, and it should be okay. But, part of that is we could do better. I think there are better ways of doing those processes where you could actually make it so it doesn't hold up projects as much. But also, like if you pushed it to, as Bill was saying, consultation before you even decide you're going to build freeway through grandma's grave.
All right. Well, I think, this is just an introduction to our next episode, I have a feeling.
That's it for another episode of the CRM Archaeology Podcast. Links to some of the items mentioned on the show are in the show notes for this podcast, which can be found at www.archpodnet.com/CRMArchPodcast. Please comment and share anywhere you see the show. If you'd like us to answer a question on a future episode, email us. Use the contact form on the website, or just email chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Support the show and the network at archpodnet.com/members. Get some swag and extra content while you're there. Send us show suggestions and interview suggestions. We want this to be a resource for field technicians everywhere, and we want to know what you want to know about.
Thanks, everyone, for listening, and we'll see you in the field.
Take it easy.
Thank you for having me on this podcast, Heather. It's been a real pleasure.
Andrew always like went up and you can't follow that. You can't just be like, because it just seems like copycat. I can't just say goodbye. Because it's just like, this schmuck here couldn't even like thank Heather.
I know.
Andrew, man, all right, from now on, I'm going before Andrew on everything.
Yeah, you better. You better hurry it up.
You're so welcome, Doug. All right.
Goodbye, guys.
The Archaeology Podcast Network is 10 years old this year. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy, our social media coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht, and our chief editor is Rachel Roden. The Archaeology Podcast Network was co-founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in 2014 and is part of Cultural Media and DigTech LLC.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.